All right, hello, and welcome to my channel. This channel is for the purposes of education, and we try to take deep dives into great and unheralded theories of everything. Grand unified theories, all-encompassing theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, earth-shattering discoveries, cosmologies, things that purport to speak about everything. And we try to, shed light on how to use them in your own life to edify yourself, for your quest for better spiritual, mental, physical health, your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview. Today is our 19th video that we've done on the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. And the title is somewhat deceiving because it makes it kind of seem like it's saying that the Dead Sea Scrolls are a deception. But it's really saying that there was a deception behind the dissemination of the Dead Sea Scrolls, rather. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 in a series of caves near Qumran, between Palestine and the Transjordan in 1947, about 20 miles from Jerusalem. And there were a number of different digs and findings over the course of the next 10 years, but there were really like 800 documents found, some fragmented, some complete, in various stages of repair. And they've been dated from 200 BC to perhaps 68 AD, and are said to have been written by a sect of hardcore Jews in Qumran there in that time period. There was kind of like a monastery, and there are complete copies of almost every last one of the Old Testament texts. In many cases, multiple copies. I believe there are like 30 copies of the Psalms, 20 copies of Genesis. But there are also a lot of sectarian material there, just for the sect, such as a lot of the stuff that he's going through in this chapter right here. The Damascus document, the Temple Scroll, the what is it called? The Code of Discipline, something like that. There's one that's called the War Scroll, the Copper Scroll, which is a treasure map, and many other things that shed a lot of light on New Testament scholarship, because these people definitely were, somehow related to the same people who wrote the Gospels. They use a lot of the same languages, same terminology, same phrases, same geography, and same rituals. In many cases, the similarities are even more close and specific. But right now we're in chapter 9, which is just called the Scrolls. And he's going over some of the various findings that were there in the scrolls. And we went through a number of the Temple Scroll and the War Scroll. We're now talking about the Damascus document. And the very interesting thing about the Damascus document is that it was really discovered almost 50 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls in Cairo. in 1896, and they thought it was just kind of a one-off thing, but then another identical copy or near identical copy was discovered in Qumran, and that makes it make a lot more sense. So we're talking about this scholar from Cambridge, Schechter, who came upon the Damascus document and published some stuff. Schechter published it for the first time in 1910. In 1913, Charles reprinted it in his compilation, the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament. When Robert Eisenman was given and passed on to the Biblical Archaeology Review, the computer printout which inventoried all the Qumran material in the hands of the international team, which is the team of scholars that were appointed to come up with the translations, the cataloging and decoding and translating these documents. But in the time that they got started doing that, they realized that the documents said a lot of things that were embarrassing and proved them wrong and went against their beliefs. And so then they started with the deception part of it, where they just started to stall and obfuscate and throw shade on the importance of them and publish the irrelevant parts of it and stuff like that, such that even by 1991, the documents had not really gotten out there yet in the hands of scholars, but especially the lay public. Okay, so the international team, there were listed among the items additional versions and or fragments of the Damascus document. Having been found at Qumran, they were obviously much earlier than those of the Cairo Geniza, and probably more complete. It was the Qumran parallels and the fragments of the Damascus document that Eisenman and Philip Davis of Sheffield requested to see in their formal letter to John Struniel, thereby precipitating the bitter and vindictive controversy of 1989. Why should this document be such a bone of contention? The Damascus document speaks firstly of a remnant of Jews who, unlike their co-religionists, remained true to the law. A teacher of righteousness appeared among them. Like Moses, he took them into the wilderness to a place called Damascus, where they entered into a renewed covenant with God. Numerous textual references make it clear that this covenant is the same as the one cited by the community rule for Qumran. And it is obvious enough, no scholar disputes it, that the Damascus document is speaking of the same community as the other Qumran scrolls. Yet the location of the community is said to be Damascus. It is clear from the document's context that the place in the desert called Damascus cannot possibly be the Romanized city in Syria. Could the site for Damascus have, in fact, been in Qumran? Why the name of the location should have been thus masked remains uncertain, though simple self-preservation dictated by the turmoil following the revolt of AD 66 would seem to be explanation enough, and Qumran had no name of its own at the time. In any case, it can hardly be coincidental that, according to the international team's computer printout, no fewer than 10 copies or fragments of the Damascus document were found in Qumran's caves. Like the community rule, the Damascus document includes a list of regulations. Some of these are identical to those in the community rule. But there are some additional regulations as well, two of which are worth noting. One pertains to marriage and children, which establishes that the Qumran community were not, as Father DeVoe maintained, he was the leader of the international team, celibate Essenes. A second refers, quite in passing, as if it were common knowledge, to affiliated communities scattered throughout Palestine. In other words, Qumran was not as isolated from the world of its time as DeVoe contended. The Damascus document fulminates against three crimes in particular, crimes alleged to be rampant among the enemies of the righteous, those who have embraced the new covenant. These crimes are specified as wealth, profanation of the temple, and a fairly limited definition of fornication, taking more than one wife or marrying one's niece. As Eisenman has shown, the Damascus document thus echoes the temple scroll in referring to issues of unique relevance to the period of the Herodian dynasty. And it echoes, as we shall see, a dispute in the community which figures more prominently in another of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Habakkuk commentary. This dispute involves an individual designated as the liar, who defects from the community and becomes its enemy. The Damascus document condemns those who enter the new covenant in the land of Damascus, and who again betray it and depart. Shortly thereafter, the document speaks of those who deserted to the liar. The Damascus document also echoes the community rule and the war scroll by speaking of a messianic figure, or perhaps two such figures, who will come to Damascus, a prophet or interpreter of the law called the Star, and a prince of the line of David called the Scepter. On 5 subsequent occasions in the text, there is a focus on a single figure, the Messiah of Aaron and Israel. The significance of this Messiah figure will be explored later. For the moment, it is worth considering the implications of Damascus as a designation for Qumran. To most Christians, of course, Damascus is familiar from chapter 9 of the Acts of the Apostles, where it is taken to denote the Romanized city in Syria, that country's modern-day capital. It is on the road to Damascus that Saul of Tarsus, in one of the best-known and most crucial passages of the entire New Testament, undergoes his conversion into Paul. According to Acts 9, Saul is kind of inquisition come enforcer, dispatched by the high priest in the Temple of Jerusalem to suppress the community of heretical Jews, i.e. early Christians, residing in Damascus. The priesthood are collaborators with the occupying Romans, and Saul is one of their instruments. In Jerusalem, he is already said to have participated actively in attacks on the early church. Indeed, if Acts is to be believed, he is personally involved in the events surrounding the stoning to death of the individual identified as Stephen, later acclaimed by later tradition as the first Christian martyr. He himself freely admits that he has persecuted his victims to death. Prompted by his fanatical fervor, Saul then embarks for Damascus to ferret out fugitive members of the early church established there. He is accompanied by a band of men, presumably armed, and he carries with him arrest warrants from the high priest in Jerusalem. Syria at the time was not a part of Israel, but a separate Roman province governed by a Roman legate with neither an administrative nor a political connection with Palestine. How then could the high priest's writ conceivably run there? The Roman Empire would hardly have sanctioned self-appointed hit squads moving from one territory to another within its domains, serving arrests, perpetrating assassinations, and threatening the precarious stability of civic order. According to official policy, every religion was to be tolerated, provided it posed no challenge to secular authority or the social structure. A Jerusalem-based hit squad operating in Syria would have elicited some swift and fairly gruesome reprisals from the Roman administration. Reprisals such as no high priest whose position depended on Roman favor would dare to incur. Given these circumstances, how could Saul of Tarsus, armed with warrants from the high priest, possibly have undertaken his punitive expedition to Damascus, if that is Damascus Damascus is indeed taken to be the city in Syria? If Damascus is understood to be Qumran, however, Saul's expedition suddenly makes perfect historical sense. Unlike Syria, Qumran did lie in territory where the high priest's writ legitimately ran. It would have been entirely feasible for the high priest in Jerusalem to dispatch his enforcers to extirpate heretical Jews at Qumran, a mere 20 miles away near Jericho. Such an action would have thoroughly conformed to Roman policy, which made a point of not meddling in purely internal affairs. Jews, in other words, were quite free to harry and persecute other Jews within their own domains, so long as such activities did not encroach on the Roman administration. And since the high priest was a Roman puppet, his efforts to extirpate rebellious co-religionists would have been all the more welcome. This explanation, however, despite its historical plausibility, raises some extremely awkward questions. According to the consensus of the international team, the community at Qumran consisted of Judaic sectarians, the so-called Essenes, a pacifist ascetic sect, having no connection either with early Christianity or with the mainstream of Judaism at the time. Yet Saul, according to Acts, embarks for Damascus to persecute members of the early church. Here then is a provocative challenge, both to Christian tradition and to adherents of the consensus, who have studiously avoided looking at the matter altogether. Either members of the early church were sheltering with the Qumran community, or the early church and the Qumran community were one and the same. In either case, the Damascus document indicates that the Dead Sea Scrolls cannot be distanced from the origins of Christianity. Okay, this next section is on the Habakkuk commentary. Found in Cave 1 at Qumran, the Habakkuk Pesher, or Habakkuk commentary, represents perhaps the closest approximation in the entire corpus of known Dead Sea Scrolls to a chronicle of the community, or at any rate, of certain major developments in its history. It focuses in particular on the same dispute cited by the Damascus document. This dispute, verging on incipient schism, seems to have been a traumatic event in the life of the Qumran community. It figures not just in the Damascus document and the Habakkuk commentary, but in 4 other Qumran texts as well, and there seemed to be reference to it in 4 further texts. Like the Damascus document, the Habakkuk commentary recounts how certain members of the community, under the iniquitous instigation of a figure identified as the liar, secede, break the new covenant, and cease to adhere to the law. This precipitates a conflict between them and the community's leader, the teacher of righteousness. There is mention, too, of a villainous adversary known as the wicked priest. Adherents of the consensus have generally tended to regard the liar and the wicked priest as two different sobriquets for the same individual. More recently, however, Eisenman has effectively demonstrated that the liar and the wicked priest are two quite separate and distinct personages. He has made it clear that the liar, unlike the wicked priests, emerges from within the Qumran community. Having been taken in by the community and accepted as a member in more or less good standing, he then defects. He is not just an adversary, therefore, but a traitor as well. In contrast, the wicked priest is an outsider, a representative of the priestly establishment of the temple. Although an adversary, he is not therefore a traitor. What makes him important for our purposes is the clue he provides to the dating of the events recounted in the Habakkuk commentary. If the wicked priest is a member of the temple establishment, it means the temple is still standing and the establishment intact. In other words, the activities of the wicked priest predate the destruction of the temple by Roman troops, which happened in 70 AD. As in the War Scroll, but even more explicitly, there are references that can only be to imperial, not republican, Rome. And imperial Rome started in 28 BC. So I believe that's right. To Rome, that is, in the 1st century AD. The Habakkuk commentary, for example, alludes to a specific practice, victorious Roman troops making sacrificial offerings to their standards. Josephus provides written evidence for this practice at the time of the fall of the temple in 70 AD. And it is, in fact, a practice that would make no sense under the Republic, when victorious troops would have offered sacrifices to their gods, only with the creation of the empire, when the emperor himself was accorded the status of divinity, becoming the supreme god for his subjects, would his image or token or monogram be emblazoned on the standards of his soldiers. The Habakkuk commentary, therefore, like the War Scroll, the Temple Scroll, and the Damascus document, points specifically to the Herodian epoch. And so, normally when you read the Bible, it's kind of like the New Testament. You think about Herod and that there's this guy named Herod, but it's actually a whole dynasty of people. I think there are like 20 Herods that have various positions in the Roman government. They're not Romans; they are Idumeans, Arabs. I believe they said that they converted to Judaism, and so they're kind of half Jewish and half Arabian, but they're puppets of the Roman state, the imperial Rome. But the first Herod was from 37 BC until 4 BC, and then after that, all of his different relatives were in charge in various capacities. There was Agrippa and a bunch of names beginning with A that all had different positions at different times. Okay, that was the end of the chapter. Chapter 10 is called Science in the Service of Faith. And I guess we have time to do a few paragraphs here. According to the consensus of the international team, The historical events reflected in all the relevant Dead Sea Scrolls occurred in Maccabean times, between the mid-2nd and mid-1st centuries BC. The wicked priest who pursues, persecutes, and perhaps kills the teacher of righteousness is generally identified by them as Jonathan Maccabeus, or perhaps his brother Simon, both of whom enjoyed positions of prominence during that epoch, and the invasion of a foreign army is taken to be that launched by the Romans under Pompey in 63 BC. The historical backdrop of the scrolls is thus set safely back in pre-Christian times, where it becomes disarmed of any possible challenge to New Testament teaching and tradition. And remember, the people in the international team were almost all Catholics, Dominicans. So that's what they're trying to do, is they're trying to, disarm the Dead Sea Scrolls of any possible challenge to New Testament teaching and tradition. But while some of the Dead Sea Scrolls undoubtedly do refer to pre-Christian times, it is a grievous mistake for some perhaps delicate obfuscation to conclude that all of them do so. Pompey, who invaded the Holy Land in 63 BC, was of course a contemporary of Julius Caesar. At the time of Pompey and Caesar, Rome was still a republic, becoming an empire only in 27 BC, under Caesar's adoptive son Octavian, who took the imperial title of Augustus. If the Roman invasion referred to in the scrolls was that of Pompey, it would have involved the armies of Republican Rome. Yet the war rule speaks of a king or monarch of the invaders. And the Habakkuk commentary is even more explicit in its reference to victorious invaders sacrificing to their standards. It would therefore seem clear that the invasion in question was that of imperial Rome, the invasion provoked by the revolt of AD 66. So it's a question of whether it's AD 66 or BC 63. Those are the two Roman invasions that you have to choose from. Professor Godfrey Driver of Oxford found numerous textual references within the scrolls that provides clues to their dating. Focusing in particular on the Habakkuk commentary, he concluded that the invaders could only be the Roman legions at the time of the revolt in AD 66. This conclusion, he added, is put beyond doubt by the reference to their sacrificing to their military standards. His statements, however, elicited a vicious attack from Father DeVoe, who recognized that they led inexorably to the conclusion that the historical background of the scrolls, therefore, is the war against Rome. This, of course, DeVoe could not possibly accept. At the same time, however, he could not refute such precise evidence. In consequence, he contrived to dismiss the evidence and attack only Driver's general thesis. Quote, Driver has started from the preconceived idea that all the scrolls were post-Christian, and that this idea was based on the fallacious witness of orthography, language, and vocabulary, end quote. It was, he declared, for professional historians, quote, to decide whether Driver's motley history has sufficient foundation in the texts. It is interesting that DeVoe, who taught biblical history at the École Biblique, should suddenly, at least when he had to answer Professor Driver, don a cloak of false modesty and shrink from considering himself an historian, taking refuge instead behind the supposed bulwarks of archaeology and paleography. In fact, archaeological data reinforce the indications of chronology provided by the internal data of the scrolls themselves. External evidence concurs with internal evidence, evidence of which the consensus would seem to remain oblivious. At times, this has led to an embarrassing faux pas. DeVoe, it will be remembered, embarked on a preliminary excavation of the Qumran ruins in 1951. His findings were sufficiently consequential to justify a more ambitious enterprise. A characteristic lassitude set in, however, and no full-scale excavation was undertaken until 1953. Annual excavations then continued until 1956, and in 1958 an associated site at Ayin Feshka, less than a mile to the south, was also excavated. In his eagerness to distance the Qumran community from any connection with early Christianity, DeVoe rushed his conclusions about dating into print. In some instances, he did not even wait for archaeological evidence to support him. As early as 1954, the Jesuit professor Robert North noted no fewer than 4 cases in which DeVoe had been forced to retract on his dating. North also found it distressing that even on so crucial a matter, no specialists independently of DeVoe's influence were asked to contribute their conclusions. But it was not DeVoe's style to invite opinions that might conflict with his own and shed a more controversial light on the material. Nor was he eager to announce his errors when they occurred. Although quick to publish and publicize conclusions that confirmed his thesis, he was markedly more dilatory when retracting them when they proved erroneous. Okay, we're going to stop right there, and we'll take over tomorrow at this location. So please come back and check us out. Thanks for tuning in today, and have a